Hello everybody, Luke Taylor here for another album review, and today's album is 2014 Chevelle La Gárgola. So La Gárgola is Spanish for the gargoyle, and it's very clear from the cover image, kind of the red and black motif with, it's obviously Pete himself, but with the plague mask, the old school plague mask with the beak. This album has a lot in common with horror films and with dark and taboo subjects. And that's as good a place as any to say that the subject matter on this album is probably my favorite. That and sci-fi crimes are probably my favorite. And the way they inspire Pete in all of his writing is just fantastic. So I'm just going to talk about how awesome this album is. I really love this album. This is the second album with Joe Barresi as producer, and he has a very distinct sound. I think him and Chevelle, especially mature Chevelle, you know, they're older, their parents, this and that. Joe Barresi fits older Chevelle so good, so well. So I just can't say enough about the stuff that Joe Barresi and Chevelle do together. I hope that if there is an album after the North Corridor, that Joe Barresi will do it as well. Just to talk about Joe Barresi, this is by far the biggest sounding Chevelle record. It sounds massive. It just sounds amazing. There's so much production in here, and not in a way where you're like, oh, time for another record. Let's load it with gimmicks, and this is all fun stuff that we learned. No, this is just everything in here is purposeful, and it's perfect because this album is loaded with atmosphere and all kinds of creepy little extras and reverb and strange riffs and odd time signatures. And I feel like in some ways if someone like, okay, who's Chevelle, what are they about, I want to hand them this record and say this is them. In some ways you can give them an earlier record that has more catchy songs, more hits, and not that that's a bad thing, more radio friendly stuff, but this is the more darker, disturbing, and not in a bad way, I mean in a more interesting way, more psychological. There's a lot of songs about what makes you afraid, fear, different things, psychological things, like I said, that unite us as human beings, you know, that are very human issues. And they're not like things that are out there as much as things that are like in here, and you're thinking about it, you're reflecting it, and you're coming to this place where you're dealing with the conflict that comes from these issues and these things. And you know, just for my 2 cents in the interpretation of the art, you know, when you think about the guy wearing the plague mask, then you think of he's protecting himself from a contagion that's going around. But if he's the only one wearing the mask, he's the anachronism. He's the one that looks weird. It makes me think of the Omega Man in a way. And I know that Pete was really inspired by horror movies, especially at this time. They had some stuff like that on their live set that they decorated. But just musically speaking, it's heavy, but it's still really listenable. It's really it's very musical. I think it's the most musical sounding record. Now Pete will always write riffs for his voice, so they're not like, you know, traditional 4-chord choruses. They're always kind of like matching his voice, and there's had like these snake-like riffs and these kind of cyclical kind of rhythms and stuff, and really cool drop D, you know, one finger, one note stuff. And I just think that the perfect mix of all Chevelle eras is here. You have, you know, the earlier aggression, you have the more progressive Tool flavor, but again, if I were them, I'd be tired of hearing that they sound like Tool, because they don't. They sound like Chevelle. That's why I would give someone this record and say, this is Chevelle, they sound like this, and they're their own band, they're their own thing. They do what they want. And as far as this record with Hats Off to the Bull and the North Corridor, I think they kind of create this dark trilogy almost. It's almost like them, you know, Chevelle and Joe Barresi are kind of making this little story. And if you think this is the second act in the movie, traditionally the second act in the movie is really dark, because that's when bad things happen that you have to overcome later in the third act. And if you think of it that way, the North Corridor is much more interesting. But just as far as the way that it sounds, it's massive. It's absolutely massive, really fat and really full, but really easy to listen to because it feels like a completely linear album. Now what I mean by that is it's not like, oh, we have a bunch of like radio-friendly hits and then it's over. It feels like the whole thing is a journey, and they're kind of have this whole statement, but it's very subtle. And I feel that this is the one for the intelligent Chevelle fans. You know, it has great songs, great songs. I think "Take Out the Gunman" is one of the most Chevelle songs, probably one of their most iconic songs, because it's just so it's just so much like, it reminds me the tiniest bit of the Red on that real little groove they got at the beginning, but it's just so much like it's who they are. I'm gonna stumble to try to explain that. You just have to listen to it and know only this band can do this. I guess that's what I'm saying. Only Pete can sound like that and can kind of make this flavor. It feels so in the moment. There's a lot of in the moment stuff that feels like that to me. But that said, which is really interesting, I know that they demoed all these songs before they went in the studio, which is a brilliant move. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of work, but you know, before you go into the studio and before you take all that time, the songs are already done precisely and perfectly. You're like, you made it as good as you can, and then you bring it to a studio, and then some more magic happens. But that's really amazing. I think that really shows in making, this is the best point I can make. It seems like an extremely conscious effort to make something that feels very organic and inspired and in the moment. And that's one of the hardest things you can do, I think. It's like comedy, you know, when you're watching something that's like a comedy show or something, and you actually think, well, they've done this joke, you know, 30, 40 takes, but it feels fresh. That's really hard to do. So I think to come out with La Gárgola at this stage in their career, you know, 2014, so many albums behind them, it's really impressive. It's very amazing because they've said a lot, they've done a lot, they don't have to prove anything, but they're just getting more into being themselves, and I'll go with them anywhere. I just think you gotta listen to this one. You know, maybe unless you're a massive Chevelle fan, there are albums you can skip because they're very good, but they're not this good. This is one of the really amazing ones. This is, I think, their masterpiece. Sci-Fi Crimes will always be my favorite, but this one is really close. Of course, This Type of Thinking, you probably saw my This Type of Thinking, could do us in review. That album's very special to me, always will be. But this one is untouchable as far as the place that they went and the way that they were inspired. Just the sound of it. Very, very, very good. Pete's use of fuzz pedals on this album is tremendous as well. It's very musical, and I feel like he's extremely underrated or underappreciated as a guitar player. And for people just to think, oh, you play guitar in a band and cool songs. No, it takes a lot to be able to do what he's doing. It's very much like a unique discipline. So I really appreciate the way that he's grown as a musician, because you tell his musical style is that. It's very musical. It suits him perfectly, and the way he uses fuzz and the way that Joe Barresi mixes it and layers it, it's really cool. It's really inspiring. I think it's one of those things where it'll come kind of across genre, and if you're into maybe sludge and doom, or you're into more like classic rock, you can find the mix of it in this. This album has that kind of mix. There's actually, in one song, it takes kind of an indie direction. Don't tell anybody. It takes an indie direction. And the song One Ocean. And you know what? I mean, if I heard it kind of by itself and thought, well, Chevelle did this, I'd be like, well, what happened? But when you listen to it on the album, where they put it, and the way it flows, it's really emotional and really beautiful. And I think that's the kind of thing, they used to just end the album with an acoustic kind of ballad, but the way that this is done kind of in the peak, in the rise and fall of emotion, it's really more effective. And it's very, very beautiful. It's probably one of their most beautiful songs. And it's something that if you just put the band in a box, you wouldn't think that they had it in them to do this song. But it sounds so natural, so it makes you think, hey, they could do this a lot more. I just think that an album like this shows that they can do whatever they want, because they do. There's plenty of headbang on this record, plenty of heavy moments, plenty of crunch, plenty of drive. I really like the way that Sam is playing the drums here. There's a couple times where I feel like the dancey groove takes over. You know, they love the dancey groove, but there's some really cool extra percussion that I know that he did, and there's a very livey feel to it. You know, it's a very like live kind of organic feeling to his drumming on this, which is really cool. And of course, in the past, you know, to make a radio friendly headbanger, you have to have a more cold and technical sound. And I think that that's completely out the window. And it's a very live and organic drum sound, which is perfect. And the last track, Twinge, is a really cool way to exit, like exit stage left. They just kind of sneak out. And a really good, I think a really good kind of horror movie, it leaves you with the thought that you carry later. It's not just shocking, it's more like disturbing. And so I like the way that this album kind of exits. It kind of just scoots out of the frame and, you know, leaves you with food for thought. And that's really important, because if you have songs that are more psychological, like, you know, what if the earth runs out of water? That's a scarier thing than, for some people, than like, oh, there's a bad guy chasing me. And this album has both of that, I think. But the way that Twinge ends the album is really that kind of like the little masterpiece touch to this perfect record. My rating is obvious. What did you think? Please let me know. I'll put a link for Out The Gunman below if you haven't heard that song. It kicks ass. I'm going to stop talking. So click the box, click the bell. I'll see you later.